Welcome, engineers. My name is TravisIQ, and today we're talking about categorizing attackers in cybersecurity environments, specifically black hat, white hat, and gray hat hacking. Let's go! Join me in the void as we begin this discussion. Let's start with the definitions and then we'll move to some really interesting stories, which are some of my favorite things to do, especially about these topics. So first we have black hat hackers. This is the type of hacker that you would think. When you think of hacking, you think of black hat hackers. These are individuals with malicious intent. They are typically operating for financial gain, political gain, the thrill. They are operating as unauthorized individuals and a lot of times for financial gain or other purposes. They are not supposed to be doing these things. They typically conduct and wreak a lot of havoc in environments, and there are tons of examples of great black hat hackers out there. Kevin Mitnick from the 90s is a great one. We'll talk more about this when we talk about trying to define these as a holistic genre, but for now, that's a great quick definition. The other side of that coin is white hat hackers. These are security professionals, penetration testers, vulnerability assessors, security auditors, members of Google's Project Zero. This is a great team that does white hat hacking and looking for vulnerabilities. Another one would be Rapid7's Vulnerability Research Team, VRT. And so what they are doing is operating as authorized individuals trying to compromise systems, find them, and then responsibly disclose them typically. Maybe they already had a relationship with the vendors. They don't have to go through the traditional responsible disclosure channels. Another great example would be bug bounty hunters. What they do is they responsibly disclose the vulnerability or the mechanism that they have used to hack a system, and then they allow that vendor time to patch that system or to address those security issues before they either write an article or publish a CVE about it and continue on their way doing additional security research. Finally, so that's a great example of white hat hacking. Finally, we have gray hat hackers. Gray hat hackers, as you might think, live between black hat and white hat hacking. What does this mean? I think a really great example would be things like bug bounty hunters, individuals that are searching publicly available systems, cloud infrastructures, network infrastructures, websites and domains that are looking for vulnerabilities to responsibly disclose within the responsible disclosure framework to then gain some monetary value. But they may or may not be operating within the cybersecurity frameworks that exist in their countries, in their states, or in their provinces, if you're in Canada, for example. And so they may or may not be adhering to all of the cybersecurity frameworks that they should be, or the legal frameworks that they should be, although their intent typically in these environments is a good intent. Okay, so we have definitions for black hat, white hat, and gray hat hackers. I'll put some definitions and some links to that content that I described there in the description below. Take a look at that if you have a second. If you have any additional questions, definitely leave the comments and I'll get to them. What I wanted to talk about now is a real-world example that I really love that relates to black hat hacking, white hat hacking, and gray hat hacking. And it pertains to an individual who you may have heard of if you're in this space by the name of Marcus Hutchins. Marcus Hutchins is a brilliant dude, a security researcher, and white hat hacker currently operating. If you go to his blog, which I will link in the description below, he is publishing CVEs annually related to applications that he has reverse engineered and looked at, and this is through a responsible disclosure framework. He does talks and does all kinds of really interesting things. And Marcus Hutchins rose to fame as a security researcher when he effectively shut off a virus, a ransomware virus known as WannaCry. Maybe if you're old enough, you know WannaCry as a ransomware virus that was locking up systems utilizing the Eternal Blue vulnerability, which is a vulnerability in Microsoft systems. Interestingly enough, that vulnerability had been identified by Microsoft and patched. And so what WannaCry was actually doing was exploiting unpatched systems. And so the systems that were hit particularly hard would have been systems that were unlicensed versions of Windows and Microsoft products because they didn't receive the patches, and typically they aren't updating and patching as frequently as they would anyways. But anyway, WannaCry was very pervasive. It was an international incident, and Marcus Hutchins reverse engineered WannaCry and found out that it was communicating back to some random domain It wasn't communicating back to it. It was actually checking a random domain for a gibberish domain to try and get a response. And if it didn't get a response, the theory is that it was a sanity check. If it didn't get a response, it was like, oh, great, right? There shouldn't be a response to this weird domain. Let's keep going. If the domain did respond, then it was a thought that maybe the virus would consider itself to be in a sandbox and shut off immediately, so it couldn't be reverse engineered in that way, for example. Anyway, what Marcus Hutchins did is he registered the domain and allowed it to respond. And when it responded, lo and behold, WannaCry was like, whoa, I shouldn't be getting a response, and stopped doing what it was doing for the most part. Now, there have been variants that have popped up and this and that, but that's what he was lauded for internationally, and was on the cover of magazines, was interviewed by a bunch of different outlets, and was essentially famous in our world at that time. He still is now to this day, but really interesting guy. Okay, so he's a white hat hacker at that time. Right? He was a security researcher based out of the UK. Great. 2017 occurs. He comes from the UK to the US for DEF CON in Vegas. Participates in DEF CON in Vegas, which is Hacker Summer Camp. If you haven't heard of DEF CON and Black Hat and DEF CON, they're really awesome conferences out in Vegas in the summertime. And when he's leaving DEF CON, he gets picked up by the FBI. And the FBI charges him with producing malware that was used in banking, in malicious banking malware, right? And specifically contributing to a banking malware product called Kronos. He spent 2 years in federal detention, and they litigated this thing, and he was convicted and sentenced to time served. So that makes him also a black hat hacker at that time. There's one more interesting thing that I will say about this that I think kind of illustrates the grayness of this area. He was famous, right? Sort of, especially in our space, he was famous. And so his legal team actually set up basically a GoFundMe. It was a donation page for his legal defense fund. And that donation page received $155,000 in donations to defend him, right, from these charges, which no one knew if they were true or not. This is where it gets really gray and really interesting. Turns out that $155,000 that was donated, of that $155K, about $150,000 was fraudulently donated from credit cards and other locations that were compromised. So about 96% of the donations were actually fraudulent donations to this GoFundMe page. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with Marcus himself, but it does say something about the way the legal defense fund is and how folks in the cybersecurity space operate, right? Because he was a black hat hacker. They were accusing him of being a black hat hacker. He was a very famous white hat hacker, and probably at some point had transitioned from a black hat hacker and contributing to malicious software development into cybersecurity research, which would, at that point in the transition, probably put him as a gray hat hacker. This is a really interesting illustration. There's actually a number of other illustrations of this. The Tom Hanks character in Catch Me If You Can, that was bank fraud, but still, right? People do this all the time, and that's not to take away from Marcus Hutchins' accomplishments or his contribution to the space currently. And he is still contributing in an extremely positive way, and I find him to be a really interesting individual, and I try to follow his contributions as well. I suggest you do the same. Check out the link in the description below. I hope you liked our black background for black hat hacking, and as is always the case, engineer, break stuff, have fun. We'll see you next time. Let's go.